Hi everybody! In this video we're going to go over how to name covalent molecules. So we're going to go over both how do we name a molecule if we're given the formula, and how do we write the formula if we're given the name. Let's get started. Here we have our periodic table. I'm going to leave this up here just in case we need to refer to it to find the name of an element. In this case, because we're dealing with covalent molecules, we aren't going to use the periodic table for valence electrons or charges, just to look at the name of the elements. All right, we're going to get started for naming. So if we're given a formula, how do we write the name? And we do this by following the two steps. So we recall that covalent molecules always are two nonmetals bonded together. So when we're naming, we name that first nonmetal that is listed, and if there are two or more atoms, we include a prefix. Then we name the second nonmetal, but we change the ending to "ide," just like we did in ionic. And you always include a prefix for the second nonmetal. So here's our table of prefixes over here. So depending on the number of atoms, we have a different prefix. And you might recognize these prefixes from things like geometry or language. Number 1 is mono, 2 is di, 3 is tri, 4 is tetra, 5 is penta, 6 is hexa, 7 is hepta, 8 is octa, 9 is nona, and 10 is deca. Okay? So what I mean by this prefix is that, so if there is any number other than 1, you always put the prefix. If the first element only has 1, you don't put a prefix. That is the only time when you don't put a prefix. We're going to get into a little more detail with that later, but I think it's going to be helpful to look at some examples. So let's take a look at this one, P4S5. Okay, so I have a 4 here. So looking at my table, I know 4 is tetra. So I'm going to write down tetra. And then I need this element, P. If we don't know it off the top of our head, we look at our periodic table and see this is phosphorus. So I'm going to write this as one word, tetra phosphorus. Okay, and now we're going to look at our second element, and we have a number 5. So number 5 is penta, so I'm going to write penta, penta. And then I need to find this element, S, which is this, sulfur. And I'm going to change the ending from sulfur to sulfide. Remember that that last syllable changes to "ide." Okay, so this becomes pentasulfide. And that's our answer, tetraphosphorus pentasulfide. Okay? All right, let's look at the second one here, B2O3. Okay? So B2O3, so we find that 2. Look at our table. We see 2 is di, so I'm going to write di. Now I need that element that's a B. So on our periodic table, we look for that. We see B is boron. So I'm going to write diboron as one word. Now I look at my second element. I see I have a 3. 3 is tri. Okay, so I'm going to write tri. And then I have O, which we see is oxygen. And so again, oxygen, just like we did for ionic, we change that ending to oxide. So we get trioxide. So overall, our name is diboron trioxide. So we see here, I'm not changing the ending of the first element, but I am changing it for the second element. Also, make sure your name should be 2 words. So the prefix plus the element is going to be 1 word, and then space for the second one. Okay? All right, let's look at this SEF6. So this is a little bit tricky here because I don't see any prefix. So when I have no number, that means it's going to be 1. So there's 1 SE. And if you see here, it says if there are 2 or more, we include a prefix. So we're not going to include a prefix for SE. And that's because it's the first element and it only has 1. So let's take a look. What is SE on our periodic table? Selenium. So I'm just going to write the word selenium. And that's it. I don't change the ending. I don't put a prefix. There's only 1 and it's the first thing listed. I just write the name. And now I'm going to be looking for the 6. 6 is hexa. So I'm going to write hexa. And my F is fluorine. And again, fluorine, we're going to change our ending to "ide" to get fluoride. And so this becomes selenium hexafluoride. That's our answer. Okay, let's look at one more example. Here we have a 2. Looking at our prefix table, 2 is di. So I'm putting di. And then my element is Cl is chlorine. If you didn't know that, you can look at your periodic table. So dichlorine, I'm writing as one word. And then I look at my 7. I see 7 as hepta. And O is oxygen, just like here. So it's oxide. Okay? So when we're naming from a formula, the first thing we do is we find the prefix based on the number, and then we write the element's name, and then we do the same thing for the second element, but we change the ending to "ide." The only exception to this is if our first element only has 1, then we don't include a prefix. Okay, let's do some examples of the other direction here when we're writing the formula from given the name. So when we're writing the formula, the first thing we do is we write the symbol of the first nonmetal, okay? And if there is a prefix, we use that to write a subscript. So that subscript is that little number underneath. Then we write the symbol of the second nonmetal, and if there is a prefix, write that subscript as well, okay? All right, so let's take a look at this example here, dinitrogen trioxide. So here I see nitrogen. If I'm not sure what the symbol for nitrogen is, I can look at my periodic table, and I see nitrogen is N. So I'm going to put an N here. And now I have this prefix di. So di is 2, so I'm going to put a little 2 underneath. And then it says trioxide. Okay, now we've done oxide several times here. We know oxide is oxygen, which is going to be an O. So I'm writing an O. And then I see the prefix is tri. And tri gives me 3. So I have N2O3. And that's my final answer. Pretty simple here. Let's do another one. We have dihydrogen monoxide. So here we go. We got hydrogen, which is symbol for hydrogen is H. If you didn't know that, you could always look at the periodic table. Now we have the prefix di. Looking at our prefix table here, we see di is 2, so I'm going to put a little 2 here. And then monoxide. So oxide again, that's our O. And when we see mono, the prefix mono gives you a 1. So you can put this as H2O1, or if it's just a 1, you don't need to include it written out. So you could just write this as H2O. And you're probably familiar with this molecule, H2O, water. The chemical name for that is actually dihydrogen monoxide. So that's a fun fact. Okay, let's look at another one here. We have dichlorine heptoxide. Okay, so chlorine, I know is Cl. If I didn't know that, I can look at it on the periodic table. I see di is 2, so I'm putting a little 2 here. Hept oxide, again, oxide is O. And then hept is 7, so I'm going to put a little 7 here. Notice that I'm putting all my numbers as subscripts. Subscripts means the number is at the bottom. I'm not putting any numbers at the top. They're always at the bottom here for covalent bonding. This is different from ionic bonding where the charge is a superscript, which is at the top. So just always remember with covalent, everything goes on the bottom. Okay, let's look at another one here. So I have iodine pentafluoride. Okay, so iodine I know is the letter I. If I didn't know, I could look on my periodic table. But I noticed there's no prefix. Now remember, when we were talking about naming, we said if the first element only has 1, there's no prefix. So that means that there must only be 1 iodine element. So I'm going to put a 1 here. And then pentafluoride. Okay, fluoride comes from fluorine, which I know is F. And then penta is 5. So I'm going to put F. So I could have I1, F5. And again, if it's a 1, you don't need to include it. So you can just also write this as IF5. Okay? So this is how we write our formula given the name. Okay? We write down the names of the elements. So we write down the symbol. Then we use the prefixes to figure out the subscripts for each. Okay? So this is not so bad so far. The only thing is we want to look at some special cases now, okay? So remember, our special case here is that if the first element has 1 atom, you don't need a prefix. If the second element has 1 atom, you do need a prefix. So we want to look at this special case with examples with elements that have only 1, okay? To figure out, do we need the prefix? Do we not need a prefix? Okay, so if it's the first element, no prefix. If it's the second one, you should have a prefix. Okay, let's look at a couple examples just to really nail down that exception here. So here we have SH4, okay, and I see that S has no number underneath it, okay? So that means there's only 1 atom. It's the first element, it only has 1. So if it's the first one, you do not need a prefix. So I'm not going to put monosulfur. I'm just going to write sulfur. Okay. Then my second element here, my 4, if I look at my prefix table, is tetra. And H is hydrogen. So hydrogen. If we cut it off after that first syllable, I get hydride. So I have sulfur tetrahydride. Okay. Let's look at another example here. So in this case, Cl3F, F, the second one, is the one that doesn't have a number underneath it. So that means there's only 1 fluorine atom. So here, okay, we say the second element, you do need a prefix. So I'm going to need a prefix for that fluorine. But let's start again with that first element, Cl3. 3, if I look at my prefix table, is tri. Cl is chlorine. And then if there's 1 F, the second element only has 1 atom, you do need a prefix. So my prefix for 1 is mono. So I'm writing mono and then fluoride. Again, notice I'm changing the ending of fluorine to fluoride. Let's do one more example here. So here we have the situation where both the C and the O have no subscripts. That means there's 1 C and 1 O. Okay? So now, which one needs a prefix? Well, we said our first element does not need a prefix, so I'm just going to write carbon for C. But our second element does need a prefix. So for O, I'm going to put monoxide. Okay? I want you to notice here that, again, I changed the ending from oxygen to oxide, and I put that prefix mono. Now, I cut off that second O, so it's not monooxide, because if it was monooxide, then you'd get monoxide, which is kind of silly sounding. So when we have one oxygen, it's monoxide. And you've probably heard of carbon monoxide. You have, hopefully, a sensor for that in your house because that is a dangerous chemical. So this answer would be carbon monoxide. Only put the prefix on the second one. All right, now let's look at the other direction. Here we have antimony tribromide. All right, first element, we see it has no prefix, so that means there's only going to be one antimony. Antimony is not an element we use all the time, so let's take a look back at our periodic table. Antimony over here is SB. I know that's kind of weird, it comes from the Latin name, but antimony is SB. Okay, so we write SB, and then tribromide. So bromide comes from bromine, so Br, and then tri is 3. So we can either write this as SB1, Br3, or just SB, Br3. I know there's only one antimony because there was no prefix. Okay, let's look at another example. Tetraphosphorus monoxide. So phosphorus, I know is P. Tetra, from my prefix table, is 4. And then monoxide. So again, oxide here was our O. And then I see mon, right? That mon, that prefix, tells me it's 1. So I have P4O1. And again, if it's just a 1, you don't have to write it, so it can be P4O. All right, last one here, sulfur monoiodide. Okay, so here, sulfur, it does not have a prefix, so I know there's only one sulfur. The symbol for sulfur is S, so I'm going to put S1. And then monoiodide, so iodide, I know that's going to be I from iodine. And mono, that gives me a prefix for 1. So I have S1I1, which I can write again as just Si. So the tricky part here is that we always put the prefix for the second element no matter what the number is, but if the first element is only one atom, you do not need to include a prefix, okay? So that's what we were practicing here. Another thing that might trip us up is that we know we only need to change the ending to "ide" for the second element, and also to make sure that we're putting our subscripts as lower, right? Little numbers underneath. Okay, so those are just a couple things that might be tricky. So looking at this, we talked about when we are naming how we always use our prefix table to figure out the number and use that prefix. Then we keep the full name of the first element listed and change the ending for the second one. Then we talked about when we're writing formulas, we use the prefix to find the number for the subscripts, and then we find the symbols for each element and put the subscripts under each. And then we looked at this special case here for the first element only having one atom, does not need to have a prefix, but the second element having one atom does need that prefix, okay? And we went through a couple examples of that. So hopefully this clarified your understanding of how to name covalent molecules. If you have any questions, you can of course email me. Thank you so much.